A Mason-Dixon Memory by Clifton Davis. Dondre Green glanced uneasily at the civic leaders and sports figures filling the hotel ballroom in Cleveland. They had come from across the nation to attend a fundraiser for the National Minority College Golf Scholarship Foundation. I was the banquet's featured entertainer. Dondre, an 18-year-old high school senior from Monroe, Louisiana, was the evening's honored guest. Nervous? I asked the handsome young man in his starched white shirt and rented tuxedo. A little, he whispered, grinning. 1 month earlier, Dondre had been just one more black student attending a predominantly white school. Although most of his friends and classmates were white, Dondre's race was never an issue. Then, on April 17, 1991, Dondre's black skin provoked an incident that made nationwide news. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC said, our special guest, Dondre Green. As the audience stood applauding, Dondre walked to the microphone and began his story. I love golf, he said, quietly. For the past 2 years, I've been a member of the St. Frederick's High School golf team. And though I was the only black member, I've always felt at home playing at mostly white country clubs across Louisiana. The audience leaned forward. Even the waiters and bus boys stopped to listen. As I listened, a memory buried in my heart since childhood fought its way to life. Our team had driven from Monroe, Dondre continued. When we arrived at the Caldwell Parish Country Club in Columbia, we walked to the putting greens. Dondre and his teammates were too absorbed to notice the conversation between a man and St. Frederick Athletic Director James Murphy. After disappearing into the clubhouse, Murphy returned to his players. I want to see all the seniors, he said, on the double. His face seemed strained as he gathered the 4 students, including Dondre. I don't know how to tell you this, he said, but the Caldwell Parish Country Club is reserved for whites only. Murphy paused and looked at Dondre. His teammates glanced at each other in disbelief. I want you seniors to decide what our response should be, Murphy continued. If we leave, we forfeit this tournament. If we stay, Dondre can't play. As I listened, my own childhood memory from 32 years ago broke free. In 1959, I was 13 years old, a poor black kid living with my mother and stepfather in a small black ghetto on Long Island, New York. My mother worked nights in a hospital, and my stepfather drove a coal truck. Needless to say, our standard of living was somewhat short of the American dream. Nevertheless, when my 8th grade teacher announced a graduation trip to Washington, D.C., it never crossed my mind that I would be left behind. Besides a complete tour of the nation's capital, we would visit Glen Echo Amusement Park in Maryland. In my imagination, Glen Echo was Disneyland, Knott's Berry Farm, and Magic Mountain rolled into one. My heart beating wildly, I raced home to deliver the mimeograph letter describing the journey. But when my mother saw how much the trip cost, she just shook her head. We couldn't afford it. After feeling sad for 10 seconds, I decided to try to fund the trip myself. For the next 8 weeks, I sold candy bars door to door, delivered newspapers, and mowed lawns. 3 days before the deadline, I made just barely enough. I was going. The day of the trip, trembling with excitement, I climbed onto the train. I was the only non-white in our section. Our hotel was not far from the White House. My roommate was Frank Miller, the son of a businessman. Leaning together out of our window and dropping water balloons on tourists quickly cemented our new friendship. Every morning, almost 100 of us loaded noisily onto our bus for another adventure. We sang our school fight song dozens of times and rode to Arlington National Cemetery, and even on an afternoon cruise down the Potomac River. We visited the Lincoln Memorial twice, once in daylight, the second time at dusk. My classmates and I fell silent as we walked in the shadows of those 36 marble columns, one for every state in the Union that Lincoln labored to preserve. I stood next to Frank at the base of the 19-foot seated statue. Spotlights made the white Georgian marble seem to glow. Together, We read those famous words from Lincoln's speech at the Gettysburg, remembering the most bloody battle in the war between the states. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. As Frank motioned me into place to take my picture, I took one last look at Lincoln's face. He seemed alive and so terribly sad. The next morning, I understood a little better why he wasn't smiling. Clifton, a chaperone, said, "Could I see you for a moment?" The other guys at my table, especially Frank, turned pale. We had been joking about the previous night's direct balloon hit on a fat lady and her poodle. It was a stupid, dangerous act, but luckily nobody got hurt. We were celebrating our escape from punishment when the chaperone asked to see me. "Clifton," she began, "do you know about the Mason-Dixon line?" "No," I said, wondering what this had to do with drenching fat ladies. "Before the Civil War," she explained, "the Mason-Dixon line was originally the boundary between Maryland and Pennsylvania, dividing the line between the slave and the free states. Having escaped one disaster, I could feel another one brewing. I noticed that her eyes were damp and her hands were shaking. Today," she continued, "the Mason-Dixon line is kind of like an invisible border between the North and the South. When you cross that invisible line out of Washington, D.C. into Maryland, things change." There was an anonymous drift to the conversation, but I wasn't following it. Why did she look and sound so nervous? "Glen Echo Amusement Park is in Maryland," she said, "at last, and the management doesn't allow Negroes inside." She stared at me in silence. I was still grinning and nodding when the meaning finally sank in. "You mean I can't go to the park?" I stuttered. "Because I'm a Negro?" She nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, Clifton," she said, taking her hand. "You'll have to stay in the hotel tonight. Why don't you and I watch a movie on television?" I walked to the elevators, feeling confusion, disbelief, anger, and a deep sadness. "What happened, Clifton?" Frank said when I got back to the room. "Did the fat lady tell on us?" Without saying a word, I walked over to my bed, lay down, and began to cry. Frank was stunned into silence. Junior high boys didn't cry, at least not in front of each other. It wasn't just missing the class adventure that made me feel so sad. For the first time in my life, I was learning what it felt like to be a nigger. Of course, there was discrimination in the North, but the color of my skin had never officially kept me out of a coffee shop, a church, or an amusement park. "Clifton," Frank whispered, "what's the matter?" They won't let me go to the Glen Echo Park tonight," I sobbed. "Because of the water balloon?" he asked. "No," I answered, "because I'm a Negro." "Oh, well, that's a relief," Frank said. Then he laughed and obviously relieved to have escaped punishment for our caper with the balloons. I thought it was serious. Wiping away the tears with my sleeve, I stared at him. "It is serious. They don't let Negroes into the park. I can't go with you," I shouted. "That's pretty damn serious to me." I was about to wipe the silly grin off of Frank's face with a blow to his jaw when I heard him say, "Then I won't go either." For an instant, we just froze. Then Frank grinned. I will never forget that moment. Frank was just a kid. He wanted to go to the amusement park just as much as I did. But there was something even more important than class that night. Still, he didn't explain or expand. The next thing I knew, the room was filled with kids listening to Frank. "They don't allow Negroes in the park," he said, "so I'm staying with Clifton." "Me too," a second boy said. "Those jerks," a third muttered. "I'm with you, Clifton." My heart raced. Suddenly, I was not alone. A pipe-sized revolution had been born. The water brigade, the water balloon brigade, 11 white boys from Long Island had made its decision. "We won't go." And as I sat on my bed in the center of it all, I felt grateful, but of all, I was filled with pride. Dondre Green's story brought the childhood memory back to life. His Gofflin teammates, like my childhood friends, faced an important decision. If they stood by their friend, it would cost them dearly. But when it came time to decide, no one hesitated. "Let's get out of here," one of them whispered. They just turned and walked towards the van. Dondre told us. They didn't debate it, and the younger players joined us without looking back. Dondre was astounded by the response of his friends and the people of Louisiana. The whole state was outraged and tried to make it right. The Louisiana House of Representatives proclaimed a Dondre Green Day and passed legislation permitting lawsuits for damages, attorney's fees, and court costs against any private facility that invites a team then bars any members because of race. As Dondre concluded, his eyes glistened with tears. "I love my coach and my teammates for sticking by me," he said. "It goes to show that there are always good people who will not give in to bigotry. The kind of love they showed me that day will conquer hatred every time." My friends, too, had shown the kind of love. As we sat in the hotel, a chaperone came in waving an envelope. "Boys," he shouted, "I've just bought 13 tickets to the Center's Tigers game. Anybody want to go?" The room erupted in cheers. Not one of us had ever been to a professional baseball game in a real baseball park. On the way to the stadium, we grew silent as our driver paused before the Lincoln Memorial. For one long moment, I stared through the marble pillars at Mr. Lincoln bathed in the warm yellow light. There was still no smile, no sign of hope in his sad, tired eyes. "We here highly resolved that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom." In his words and in his life, Lincoln made it clear that freedom is not free. Every time the color of a person's skin keeps him out of the amusement park or off a country club fairway, the war for freedom begins again. Sometimes the battle is fought with fists and guns, but more often the most effective weapon is a simple act of love and courage. Whenever I hear those words from Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg, I remember my 11 white friends, and I feel hope once again. I like to imagine that when we paused that night at the foot of this great monument, Mr. Lincoln smiled at last. As Dondre said, "The kind of love that showed me that day will conquer hatred every time."